So then we now start moving into talking about gender. So it's worth noting that part of why we think about the gender system as being binary is because we build upon the concept of sex as binary. Because we think about bodies as only taking two forms, male bodies and female bodies, then it allows us as a society to then construct these additional rules and expectations around those male bodies and female bodies. So the common expectation in society is that male-bodied persons should identify as boys, later as men, and then in terms of their behavior and expression, we refer to that as being masculine. And that female-bodied persons should identify as girls and women, then later women, and in terms of their behavior and expression, they should identify as feminine. So, masculine and feminine are the terms that we use when we are speaking about gender expression, while boys, men, girls, women, these are the cisgender terms that we use when we are talking about gender identity. And so, what's meant by masculine and feminine, right? So you might think of, what men wear versus women wear. You might think of accessories that we associate with and objects that we associate more with men and more than and some more with women. You might think about activities like cooking and cleaning versus repairing a car. So we have those types of we label those activities as being masculine or feminine. And then certainly personality characteristics can be labeled as more masculine or feminine. So some of the more masculine personality characteristics that you would think of would be things like brave and strong and stoic and rational, maybe violent or aggressive, athletic, right? All of those are terms that we might associate. Powerful. All of those might be terms that, are associated with masculinity. The terms that we might associate with femininity: nurturing, gentle, empathetic, beautiful, what are some other terms that we, domestic. All of those might be terms that we associate more with femininity. Now, it's worth noting that in any society, but particularly in a society like America that's multicultural, where is a vast society where we have different regions, right? There might be multiple models of masculinity and femininity in any society at a given time, let alone how the definitions might have changed over time or how the definitions might differ, from society to society. So what I'm trying to kind of say here is that masculinity and femininity definitions in 2020 United States might be different than 2020 Sweden and 2020 Japan and 2020 Ghana and 2020 Honduras. At the same time, masculinity and femininity definitions in 2020 United States are different than the ones from 1950s United States and 1900s United States and 1775 United States. But also, the definitions of femininity and masculinity can differ within a given society at a time, right? So what Southerners see as being masculine in 2020 America might be different than what, people in New York and New Jersey define as being masculine versus what people in Texas define as being masculine, what people in California define as being masculine. Same thing with racial, ethnic, cultural groups, right? What it means to be a woman to someone who is Latina versus African American versus Korean American versus, white American of European descent. It is possible, right, that not only is it possible, we do have multiple masculinities and femininities in our society. However, at the same time, in every society, there is a dominant conception. It is the conception that we see most often in the media. It's the conception that usually, even if we don't fully agree with it, even if in some ways our own group or region might reject or tweak some parts of it, it is the dominant conception that even lives in our own minds because of the fact that it's the one that we think so many other people hold, the one that we maybe see reinforced in our media, in our schools, by our leadership. And currently, the two kind of models that we have traditionally had in America is hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity. Hegemonic masculinity, if you recognize that term, hegemony, it basically just means this is the dominant model of masculinity. It is when you say so-and-so's the man, or be a real man, or act like a man, that this is the model that most people are referencing in their mind when they say that. And emphasize femininity, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. With hegemonic masculinity, like I said, this is the model, whether the men in your life really are like this or not. This is the model that exists in our minds, right? It's a person that is athletic. It's a man who's successful. He is, tough and can do things outdoors. He's athletic. He's heroic. So he is, Tom Brady and Superman and Don Draper and Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, right? He is the Marlboro Man when he's a cowboy, and he's, the Terminator in terms of aggression and violence, and once again, being tough. And we'll come back to this when we get to our chapter on masculinity. But what is really important to emphasize right now is, obviously, this isn't who a lot of men are, but they get the message that this is maybe who they should be, or who women would want them to secretly be. And even if they aren't necessarily out there expecting to go to the NFL, it's this idea, I'm a man, I should know how to throw a football. Or, even if they know that, obviously they're not Superman and they can't fly and be faster than a speeding bullet, but it's the sense of, I should protect my lady, I should save the day. In the time of a crisis, I should be, I should take on this leadership role. It's this idea still of being successful in terms of career, and even if you aren't the sole breadwinner, maybe still even being the primary breadwinner. All of that is still just kind of wrapped in this dominant conception of masculinity. And this conception does still have a lot of strength and power in today's society. Even at the same time, we realize that a lot of men do not fit this model. Now, emphasize femininity. Now, if we were talking about, 30, 40 years ago, this model had a lot more public support back then. Nowadays, unlike hegemonic masculinity, where a lot of men maybe feel on some level that some of those traits they need to uphold to be a real man, emphasize femininity, the expectation you're supposed to be sexy, pretty, available, care about your appearance, that you should look a certain way in terms of wearing makeup and having long hair and being thin but curvy, that, you should be a domestic goddess and, know how to cook and clean and, take care of your man. In a lot of ways, and kind of especially post 1960s and 70s, and it's been picking up steam ever since with every generation that's come since then. The gender, the second wave and then later third wave of the feminist movement has kind of pushed women away from this being the dominant model for femininity. That's why we don't call this hegemonic femininity, because so many women reject so many parts of this, or they only uphold so many parts of this. But this is the image of femininity that lives in people's minds, right? For a lot of men, this might be still in the back of their minds the ideal woman. And for a lot of women, they might imagine for a lot of men that this is their ideal woman, even at the same time, even as they are making no moves to try to uphold it, right? So, they might be like, I wear sweatpants, I never wear makeup, and I can't even boil water. And they're okay with that. and they don't feel like it makes them less of a woman, but they might think that when people hear that, they think that it makes them less of a woman, because we still have this kind of special place, this pedestal, maybe might be a good word, in media in particular, for women that still uphold this emphasized femininity, right? That there is this nostalgia for this type of woman. But it's worth noting that our definitions of femininity have expanded with public support, social support, so that there are, in a lot of ways, there are many different ways in which one can be a woman and not have your womanness questioned. But the hegemonic masculinity model is still much stronger, and it's still much more ingrained in society. Ideas that we, like I said, we will come back to in this course. But for right now, just thinking to what extent you yourself describe yourself by using perhaps any stereotypical hegemonic masculinity, emphasize femininity terms, go back to your thought exercise and look at your list of your 5 traits. If you identify as a man, were any of the traits that you identified as masculine? If you identify as a woman, were any of your traits, all of your traits, feminine? I'm willing to bet that, especially in today's society, that for a lot of you, probably your list was a mix of traits that are masculine and feminine, and some traits that are maybe just gender neutral. And this idea that very few of us fit this kind of dominant conception, this dominant model of masculinity and femininity, is supported by a lot of research. But nevertheless, despite that, we believe that this binary exists. And, it's worth considering the questions that pop up on page 17. And it makes this point about, why are we clinging to this binary system when we know that this system does not work to classify everyone? When we are aware that there are 76 million people, whether you're talking in terms of their sex, their gender identity, or their gender expression, that don't fit this perfectly male or perfectly female body. And that it raises the question that if this many people are deviating in some way from the binary, is it really helpful to have the binary system? How do we decide who gets to count as a male, as a female, as a man, as a woman, when people can possibly deviate from our expectations, these binary expectations at each steps? And that last question about who cares, if bodies function but don't fit into the gender binary, is that really a problem, right? Because once again, if your body is functioning, if you have found a place, a role in society and people who love you, does it really matter if you are complicating the binary system? Like, why is that an issue? And I promise that that's a question that we will come back to at the end of this presentation. But what about all of us that are like, you know what? Okay, I get you, what you're saying, 76 million, but I'm not one of those. I'm not intersex. I'm positive that I check off all of those. I am on the normative path when it comes to chromosomes and hormones and internal and external genitalia. And when it comes to my gender identity, I identify as the gender that I identify as aligns with the sex that I was assigned with birth, i.e. I'm cisgender. And in terms of my gender expression, I more or less uphold what is expected of me in terms of my masculinity and or femininity. So what about the rest of those people, right? Because that is 90%, right? That is the vast majority of us. Are we opposite sexes then? So it's like, okay, if we throw out our outliers, if we throw out our anomalies, what about the rest of us? Aren't we very different? Well, let's look and consider some of the evidence. Last time we talked about height, and I did make the point that generally speaking, within a given society, oftentimes men are taller on average than women, but there is that huge overlap. And then, as I emphasize, because height is genetic, if you then look at it globally, so we're talking about all men versus all women, then it becomes even more muddy because there are some countries that are very tall. And so the tall men are taller than the tall women. But then there are countries that are short, where the short men are taller than their short women, but they are shorter than that tall country's tall women. And then this just kind of throws a lot of our strong height correlate, height and sex correlate gets kind of thrown out the window there. We've already mentioned body hair. Yes, because men, secondary sex characteristic, when they develop testosterone, they undergo that second testosterone bath around puberty. That does lead to them being hairier. But once again, there are differences with race, different racial groups. There are some race ethnicities that are much hairier than others. And so once again, their men might be hairier than their not so hairy women, but their not so hairy men might be less hairy or equally as hairy as the women of racial ethnic groups that are hairier. Oh God, that was a tongue twister. I hope you followed me there. But all that's just to say, once again, there isn't this perfect like binary where, oh, you're hairy, you must be a male. You're not hairy, you must be a female. That in general, human beings, we're mammals, we are just pretty hairy. Something like breast, yes, generally speaking, women have breasts, men don't, but there is a condition where men develop breast. And of course, breast size in women is very variable. And then in general, as society has become larger in terms of their body fat percentage, this also has kind of muddied our distinction between, oh, you have breast, you must be a female-bodied person versus a male-bodied person. Musculature, same thing really kind of as breast, once again, and height. Generally speaking, men have the ability, depending on genetics and hormones, so they have the ability to develop more muscles, but keyword there is develop. That if they do not, oftentimes, if they don't act on this, if they don't actively develop it, they can be very slender, or like I said, especially in our society with the growing number of people at higher body fat percentages, they aren't muscular at all. And back when I used to manage a gym, there were always women that were very concerned about getting bulky. And admittedly, once again, there is a genetic element. Some women are more muscular than other women, but usually because of that lesser amount of testosterone, women have to really work hard and usually take some supplements to develop musculature. But once again, they can do it. So there still is not this perfect binary where if you see someone that has broad shoulders, that you can be like, oh yes, I can tell by those shoulders that you must be a male-bodied person, because there are men who don't have those shoulders and there are women who do. Check out the CrossFit Games. And then finally, reproductive abilities, right? So some people will be like, well, women are women, female bodies are distinct because they can bear children or they menstruate. And it's always worth noting, of course, once again, you're talking about the normative path, right? Thinking back to that table, but not all female bodies are able to menstruate and not all are able to reproduce. Admittedly, of course, male bodies can't do either. But it's once again, it's not a all none statement, because not all female bodies can do it either for a variety of reasons and conditions. And so then your book kind of makes this point that some of those perceived differences, particularly things maybe like related to body hair, breast, and musculature, some of them aren't as rooted in biology, but in behavior. And they refer to this as body work, right? That we work on our bodies in order to better fit the binary. And because so many of us are doing this body work, this helps reinforce and support the binary because it makes us look more different than what we are. And this goes back to the shiny armpits and the apocalypse example, right? People think women aren't as hairy as they are because so many of us women, myself included, so don't think I'm attacking anyone here, but so many of us women work hard at body work to get rid of our body hair that helps align with this perception that we aren't really as hairy as we are. So, if you're one of the many, many women who spends time, money, energy, and effort shaving and waxing and using depilatory and getting electrolysis, right? All of which to give off this impression of course I don't have hair on my lip, or hairs that grow out of my chin, or hairs, on my arms or on my legs, right? It's not a natural biological difference. That difference of women aren't that hairy is rooted in behavior, right? Our decisions to remove body hair. Similarly, right, the idea that men are short haired and women are long haired. Well, and admittedly that's changing with all the men that are growing their hair out, to make man buns and ponytails and just long, luxurious waves and or dreads, right? This maybe isn't so much a belief as what it used to be, where you're thinking about in the 50s where everybody maybe is rocking that crew cut or fade. But once again, that wasn't biology necessary so much as it was behavior. Men getting regular haircuts at the barber and women being expected to grow their hair and keep their hair long. And so this body work, and your book makes the wonderful example about, we know that we can fake the body of the supposed opposite sex by looking at, drag kings and queens. And, certainly RuPaul, who's featured here on the slide, and the popularity of his show Drag Race. I mean, some of those drag queens are easily passable for females, that their hair, their makeup, how they exercise, how they wear corsets and wear heels, right? They have the ability to so perfectly mimic the female bodied aesthetic that people would just think that they are female bodies. And although drag kings are, I think, less well known, I give you an example of one in the upper right. It's the same thing, right? That same performative aspect. And we're about to talk about transgender here in a second. So while I'm on drag kings and drag queens, let me just emphasize part of what sets them apart from transgender, or people that we speak of as even being gender queer, gender fluid. Those are all identity terms. Drag kings and queens, it is often explicitly a performance. It's worth noting that RuPaul identifies as a man. In his case, he identifies, as a homosexual man, but that has nothing to do with his performance as a drag queen. That is a performance. And if you watch the show, you will know that this is a subject that has come up. And actually, I know I'm getting off track here, but I just find this interesting. It actually came up in a very controversial way a few years ago, when they had a transgender woman on there on the Drag Race, because it was like, okay, well, if you identify as a trans woman, that's different than the rest of the contestants who are doing this performative aspect, because in that contestant's case, it's like, this is an identity for you. And drag queens, by and large, identify as men, some homosexual men, some heterosexual men, because once again, sexual orientation has nothing to do with gender identity, and it also has nothing to do with a person's decision to be a drag king or queen. So your book, after introducing this concept of drag queens and kings, it pushes you to consider Yes, most of us aren't drag kings and queens, but we do what they call everyday drag, meaning we use our makeup and our hair choices and our workouts. And, if you've ever bought a waist trainer or taken flat tummy tea, but we do this body work to also better fit the binary. And they call this everyday drag, right? We are reinforcing the binary by going out of our way to try to look like this kind of ideal conception of this is what male bodies look like, this is what female bodies look like.